Welcome back, everyone, to the 2021 Brooklyn Antiquarian Book Fair virtual edition. We're having another virtual edition this year because of COVID, and hopefully we'll be back in the regular area where we normally have the fair at the Brooklyn Expo Center in Greenpoint next year. But for now, we're really happy to be able to have so many great speakers from all over the country, all over the world, because of the virtual edition that is provided by Getman's Fairs. So if you haven't already been there, go over to brooklynbookfair.com, check out all the virtual booths. It's going from September 23rd to the 26th. This show is called Finders Keepers. It's actually about creative people, obsessives, historians, researchers. And today, right now, we have one of the very premier researchers, historians, writers in Los Angeles, who wrote mostly about the mid-20th century and has really escalated the knowledge that we have of Los Angeles's contribution to art and music. He's also a great friend of mine and somebody that I should say I collaborated with on a number of things, including Dumb Angel #4 All Summer Long, the book Pop Surf Culture, and more recently we both contributed to this book about Michael Dormer, also a Southern California artist who was involved with the Beat Generation and surfing. He's written or contributed to 10 books, and probably the thing that really cemented his legacy as a historian is the book Riot on Sunset Strip, Rock and Roll's Last Stand in Hollywood. And if anyone has not read that yet, it's a masterpiece, and it took him 20 years to research and complete. And during that time, he actually became a historian of what went on before the rock and roll generation and the psychedelic era in Hollywood. And he really did a thorough job of researching jazz and folk and Beat Generation coffee houses and everything that sort of led up to the mid-60s folk rock and psychedelic and protest scene that was happening in LA. And that's what we're going to be talking about here today. I'm going to interview Domenic and have a dialogue with him about the Beat Generation in Los Angeles, which is a very, very understudied subject and something that he and I have a deep interest in together and have worked on some stuff together. So really happy to present this. Happy to have Domenic. Say hello to the world, Domenic.
Hello to the world. Entire world.
Yeah. So one thing that you and I have done over the years is we've done a slideshow on the Beat Generation in LA. We called it Cafe LA. And one of the guys that was in the slideshow and somebody that we ran across quite a lot was this guy, Bert Schomburg. And there's now an exhibition of his 50s work at the Buckland Museum in Cleveland. And maybe that's a good place to start. What was happening in LA with a guy like Schomburg and him having his own cafe and doing murals for all these other cafes? Can you kind of set the scene for us of what it was like in the 1950s in LA?
Yeah, well, as you said, it's an undertold story, especially in Los Angeles. Los Angeles has really great historians that live here today, and most of them are completely not acknowledged as such. There's guys like Charles Phoenix and Chris Nichols and all these Alan Hess, great architecture historians and just pop culture historians that recognize, LA was a little bit more than the fluff that other cities might think. Well, I lived in San Francisco, so I know what that's like. They like for example, in San Francisco, they always say Los Angeles is plastic and all this other stuff. And of course, Andy Warhol came to LA and said, I love plastic. I want to be plastic. So however it goes. But in the 50s, there was, a culture here of, being near the coastline and getting away from the urban culture and getting into nature. And that kind of got going in sort of Santa Barbara, Topanga Canyon area in the early 50s and maybe even earlier. But it became a real solid thing by the second half of the 50s. There were cafes in Venice, like the Venice West, I believe, started in 1956. And Venice was the sort of the center of the Beat Generation for the LA city people. So it happened out at the beach to other places too, like I said, Topanga is near Malibu. There were places in Malibu, but also down in Laguna Beach. Bert Schomburg had his cafe, and it was all a gestation of a larger movement in this city that is spread out. I think it was best said to me by John McEwen of the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band. He says, well, there was much great folk music and Beat Generation stuff in LA as there was in New York or San Francisco. But the problem was you had to drive everywhere and you had to drive lots of miles out. Laguna Beach is so far away from Topanga, and Pasadena is far away from both of them. They're really far. But these people here just were used to getting in their jalopies and riding around and getting to all those places. And people think Orange County is being this really conservative place, but actually there was a lot of Beat Generation coffee houses in Orange County. Bert Schomburg had his place there in Orange County. So, and he came to Hollywood and did all kinds of paintings for like the Purple Onion on Sunset Boulevard, and a variety of other restaurants and smaller cafes.
So how many are we talking about exactly, and what kind of territory? I mean, are you ending at Topanga and Malibu, or do you take it further? And what are you considering like the Los Angeles or Southern California beat scene? And how many, again, how many are we talking about here?
You might have around 50 of them or something like that. Again, some of them were pretty tiny. I mean, there's a picture of a place up in the Pasadena area where it looks like about the size of your living room, and there's seats in this like living room, but on stage is a group that David Lindley happened to be in when he was very young. These pictures that I have. So a lot of great people were finding these places, and that's why LA had such a fantastic movement in the mid 60s, because it all started to develop early on in the 50s. And the 50s part of it is really overlooked because, as I mentioned, there are a lot of great LA historians that live in Los Angeles right now. Their work kind of gets ignored by City Hall. It gets ignored by PBS. It gets ignored by everybody. These people are all very good, and they have all these great different aspects of the stories to tell. In the case of the 1950s, it gets overlooked because the mainstream look at Los Angeles history is 100% the movies, the movies, the movies. And that's it. That's all that ever happened here is movies, movies, movies. But, most of the movie, the Hollywood glamour stuff, the nightclubs of the 30s and the 40s, by the 1950s, Las Vegas was growing up, and it was being created for the Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Jerry Lewis kind of people to play in Vegas, and they could not play Los Angeles. So the smaller clubs they played in LA were empty, and it was recreated. Ben Shapiro from a place called the Renaissance was really the pioneer in about 1956, opened up the Renaissance on the Sunset Strip, and then Gene Norman opened the Crescendo also on the Sunset Strip, and before you know it, there's real jazz up there. The Pandora's Box Club opened in 58. The Sea Witch opened in 57. So these are not movie star hangouts, although funny enough, Abbott and Costello went to the debut of the Sea Witch in 57, just before one of them passed away. So the bottom line is the movie star history becomes so large, it obscures the art history, and it obscures the music history, because most of the music history sticks to the corporate rock story and doesn't really go to, the beginnings of all that.
Well, I think that brings up a kind of double good question for me. Like, one, why Venice? And because you mentioned a couple questions ago that the central nexus of the Beat Generation scene as it developed in the late 50s in LA was really centered around Venice, and everything kind of took off from there. And also, like, the 50s obviously has this reputation for being ultra conservative, ultra puritanical, and yet there was a lot of subculture and controversy that was brewing, not just the Beat Generation, but I mean, basically the government went sort of berserk about like horror comics and social, anybody that was socialist in their ideology or anything. I mean, really, it's like So
Well, the Hollywood 10 was the big LA problem. I mean, you know, a lot of great screenwriters got thrown down into the wash thanks to that.
right, the blacklist, and it extended, you know, into so many other areas of the movie industry. But who were these guys, you know, in Venice, and you know, where were they getting these, you know, completely provocative and rebellious attitudes from? You know, where was all this germinating from, in terms of the culture, psychically? What was happening? If you could set the scene in Venice for us.
I think the neighborhood itself was created in 1905 by a guy named Abbott Kinney, who wanted it to be the center of art in LA, because LA was basically, I always tell people that Los Angeles in the 1800s was kind of like a cow town. It was really like, you know, the main thing was they were selling cow hides in LA to people in Boston because it was fashionable in the mid 1800s. That's all that was here, you know, and some missions and things like that. In the late 1800s, some development happened, and by the early 1900s, you know, Abbott Kinney got the idea we need, you know, Venice was going to be this place where the Chicago Symphony Orchestra played. Sarah Bernhardt played there at the Venice Pier. They had this great festival hall, so to speak.
He wanted that to happen, or that did happen?
That did happen between 1905 and 1925. Venice had canals, and they had this pier that had what was basically the Lincoln Center in New York, or the Music Center here in downtown LA. Abbott Kinney created the very first place where classical music and orchestras and things like that, and classic theater could happen. And that kind of crumbled in the late 20s when cars started happening, and they closed in all these canals, and it was struggled just to be an amusement park practically by then. So Venice was, by the 40s, really, really dying out. They tore down the pier in 1946, and in the 50s, Venice was just this vacated place, but it had this kernel of this, was created for arts, and it was beautiful. It looked like Venice, Italy. It was created to look like Venice, Italy. So all these bohemian types wound up in the cheap rent of Venice, and it was the perfect location for an arts thing to explode.
So tell me, like, who are we talking about here that were sort of the avatars of that scene, and did they leave anything behind in terms of artwork or books, or, you know, what kind of legacy are we talking about? Because it's not the same, obviously, as in terms of reputation as like Kerouac, Ginsberg, and Burroughs, and all of that, but I'm assuming that these people have a published legacy, or in the case of some of the artists, like are any of them well known?
Yeah, Wallace Berman, of course, would be the best known artist from LA at that time. And there was a great show a few years back when I was living in New York called Seminiculture that exposed that to not only New York, but the rest of the world. And there was a woman named Cameron who was out there, who, you know, was in that circle of people who did great art. And she just had an exhibit a few years ago.
And she was on the cover of Wallace Berman's Semina magazine, right? The first issue.
Right. And it was a piece of Cameron's artwork, actually, that got Wallace Berman's first show at the first Ferris Gallery show on La Cienega here in LA, where Warhol later did his first show in '62. Well, the first Ferris show was 1957. A lot of Venice people and other people, artists in LA, you know, came down on this place on La Cienega called the Ferris Gallery and created it. Walter Hopps and others, Ed Keenholz and Walter Hopps created it. And then Irving Bloom came in, and he's the one with all the soup cans now. We're
seeing all the
paintings anyways, but Irving Bloom has them. But those guys created Ferris Gallery, so it was like as Venice kind of moved into the main art gallery scene in Los Angeles at that time. But it really was also, you know, there was guys like Stuart Perkoff, who was a poet, who remained in Venice, and there was, you know, it sort of got bigger, and actually Stuart Perkoff ended up on an episode of Groucho Marx TV show You Bet Your Life as a game show contestant, and that's because Groucho and Stan Laurel of Laurel and Hardy pitched in to help save Venice as a place that Bohemia could exist.
And was it So what happened in terms of like, you mentioned that there was a coffee house down there called the Venice West Cafe, right? And
Yeah.
so that was sort of the central place, but were there art galleries? Were there other coffee houses?
Yeah, the main one would be a larger place that only lasted a couple years, like 1960, 61 or something, but it was called the Gas House. And that Gas House was a much larger space than the Venice West. It was in one of Abbot Kinney's original Venetian style buildings. It was this huge room. And so there'd be like live jazz in the corner over here and people crashing out on a couch over here and poetry readings and lots of room for all kinds of art at the Gas House.
Do we know what any of the artists that played at these places?
Paul Horn is one of them.
And another guy that had made a famous song in 1948 with Nat King Cole.
Well, yeah, Nature Boy, Eden Abez, he performed in some of these places, but also performed just down the road a little bit in Hermosa Beach at a place called the Insomniac Cafe, which is another, bastion of great music, especially music and art, because across the street from the Insomniac Cafe was the Lighthouse, which was a jazz club, but it was the jazz club where West Coast Cool was technically invented. About 1949, 50, 51, they got it together. Howard Rumsey and his All-Stars played there. Shelly Manne was the original drummer. But a lot of these guys, like Shelly Manne, they'd all moved from New York. The insane thing is this. New York City, 1938, 52nd Street. Bessie Smith plays someplace on 52nd Street, and all of a sudden 52nd Street is the real hot spot between 38 and about 51. And after like 1951, when 52nd Street closed, who comes out here? All the main guys. Art Tatum was like the house band of house band guys in 52nd Street. He came and he played at the Crescendo regularly. There's a live album of him at the Crescendo in the 50s, just before he passed away. Red Norvo was another like really hot, important 52nd Street guy that came out and played jazz in Los Angeles. So there was this migration from 52nd Street, like the outliers of the 52nd Street scene between 38 and 51 started to come to the Strip.
And weren't the guys who played on and wrote most of the music on Miles Davis's Birth of the Cool album, like, didn't they come out of Juilliard, and then it was like Lee Konitz and Jerry Mulligan? They were such big presence. They had such a big presence in the cool jazz scene on the West Coast. So was that literally like a Birth of the Cool thing happened in New York and then it really took off in LA?
Yeah, it was a shared economy. Let's put it that way. Because Ornette Coleman started out here at a place called the Hillcrest Club on, it was in South Central, I believe on Washington Boulevard. And Coleman worked there for like a couple of years, developing everything that he debuted in New York in 59, I guess. And then a lot of people might even consider Ornette Coleman a quote unquote New York artist, but he had developed it at the Hillcrest and another little joint downtown, which I can't remember the name of at the moment, but he started out playing it in a gay bar downtown, actually. It was like, and of course, a gay bar in the 50s is not supposed to exist. So that's where he could do a lot of esoteric stuff, And the same thing happened with the band Arthur Lee and Love. They played first in a gay bar. They were a multiracial band, and there was a place called Brave New World, which is a gay bar on Melrose. And so much like Ornette Coleman in a gay bar downtown, stretching out and doing whatever it is that became free jazz, Arthur Lee and Love did the same thing at Brave New World, and then he took it over to another place called Beatolitos, and eventually they headlined the Hullabaloo and the bigger clubs, Whiskey A Go-Go, and so on.
Is there an association between their experimentation and the gay bars?
I think so, because in those two cases especially, Love was a multiracial band, and there hadn't been, a playing multiracial band really. There was the Del Vikings during the 50s, a doo-wop group, great rock and roll group that had 2 white guys and 3 black guys. And what happened with them is they had some hits, and the white guys couldn't play with the black guys in a lot of gigs, the engagements, they wouldn't let the white guys play with the black guys. So eventually the Del Vikings had to like tell the white guys they had to leave the group, and there became a group of 5 black guys. That's how racist it was in the 50s. So when Arthur Lee and Love started to play, they started playing in a gay bar, because anything can happen in a gay bar. A gay bar wasn't even supposed to exist.
And the Pyramids too. I cut you off.
Oh, well, the Pyramids played at a little place. There was a surf instrumental group, the Pyramids, and they played in a place called the Airport Club down in Seal Beach, which later became a hipper joint called the Mecca. But it started out, the Airport Club was a sort of a gambling place that the parents started saying, okay, the teenagers can play here now, and I can Tina Turner played there and everything.
You know, Bert Schomburg lived in Seal Beach for more than half of his life.
Yeah.
But was there anything else happening there? That's right on the edge of LA County and Orange County. And
yeah, there was a very small place called Rouge et Noir. And Rouge et Noir lived in this little small place. And then they found a bigger place down the street, and it became like the Gas House in Seal Beach, a version of the Gas House, so to speak.
And what was?
And those guys, by the way, opened up the Golden Bear in Huntington Beach. It should be said, and Prison of Socrates down in Newport Beach. So they created maybe 5 places that, boho could exist.
Who were those guys?
Ted, I remember Ted Nikas is one of the names. I can't remember all the names. Ted Nikas was the booker.
So this was happening in Orange County, and the Golden Bear especially has an incredibly storied history. So
it lasted a long time. That's why it lasted until the very early 80s, when Huntington Beach tore everything down and tried to create a new Miami there, which failed. Became a huge white elephant, and nobody goes to Huntington Beach.
Right, but didn't Jackson Browne play at the Rouge et Noir and the Golden Bear? I mean, that's like part of his lore.
Right. Here's another, if you want to make a New York connection to that era, is Jackson Browne came from, well, he originally was from Highland Park area, sort of an East LA vibe. And that's why on the cover of his album, The Pretender, he kind of dresses a bit like a cholo, because he really comes from that kind of a neighborhood. And his parents moved him out to Fullerton because they didn't want to see their son become a little, Anglo cholo. So Jackson moved out there, and he started playing in a little folk club around that area called the Mecca. But he played at this other joint in the city of Orange, or Tustin, sorry. There were places like in the city of Tustin where like Jackson Browne, not just Jackson Browne, but his quote unquote almost mentor, Tim Buckley, in that Tim Buckley had been playing those same Orange County folk clubs and beat generation type clubs. And he went to New York and had success on Elektra Records. So Jackson Browne followed, Tim Buckley on Tim's suggestion to New York. And that's how he met Linda Eastman, and all those great, Linda Eastman photographs of Jackson Browne as a scruffy young kid in New York exist because Tim Buckley told Jackson to come out there and get his career going, which Jackson actually kind of held back on releasing an album until 72. He was actually wise enough to not just make a flash in the pan record and then just die out. He orchestrated his career pretty intensely in a way that nobody else kind of did. He waited until the 70s almost, in a way.
But he did work with some other groups that were centered in LA in the late 60s, right?
Jackson Browne worked with, actually, he played 1 or 2 gigs with, as I mentioned, John McEwen's group, the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band. Jackson was in that, and they recorded about 5 Jackson Browne songs because they had access to them. But one of those songs is These Days, that Nico also recorded. When Jackson Browne moved to New York, he became Nico's lover and also songwriter for 5 of the songs on the debut Nico album. So,
yeah, no, that's a really cool piece of information there. And it's like, I feel like there's so much that contributed from these nightclubs and the folk scene and the surf scene and the jazz scene that kind of moved into the mid 60s scene. And you make that like really, really crystal clear in this. But how did that transition happen sort of step by step? Were there any like media outlets or events that sort of galvanized things? Like, was there a newspaper or any kind of, place where people could think about and find out about all this? Because if we're talking about Tustin and Seal Beach and I mean, how is all this stuff interconnected?
Yeah. Well, Tustin and Seal Beach are in Orange County. Malibu and Venice and all that is in LA County. So they are far away. I think there's one event that happened, and it's kind of funny because this event still exists, but people have a certain impression of it. So I don't want them to think about this in the way they know it already. But that's the Renaissance Pleasure Fair. Now, in 1964, the Renaissance Pleasure Fair started as a yay oldie folk music event, and that's folk with a Q, and it was really an attempt to kind of find the roots of folk music and have a wonderful afternoon, milling about and learning about folk music culture and where it came from and so on and so forth. And I think one of the early Renaissance fairs was the song Renaissance Fair by the Byrds was written about it. David Crosby, of course, a guy who'd been playing coffee houses on the West Coast from Seattle to San Diego and down to Mexico even. David Crosby and Billy Roberts and the other guy, Dino Valente, all knew each other, and that's where the song Hey Joe came from. Just the fact that Seattle and Mexico were connected because it was all the West Coast and you're playing coffee houses up and down the West Coast. The greatest concentration of them was in LA and San Francisco.
Do you know what coffee houses David Crosby played in specifically before he joined the Byrds?
David Crosby's dad was Floyd Crosby, and he won a cinematography Oscar for High Noon. So that ambiance of the West is really, heavy in David's lineage. Let's put it that way. And he was playing coffee houses in the Santa Barbara area, around 1960 and so. And they, you might remember the names of them better than I do.
I remember the Iopan.
Yeah, in one of those places, Bud and Travis, who were a local Los Angeles folk group who had a hit called Cloudy Summer Afternoon. They were one of the first successful folk groups out of LA. Travis Edmondson was the guy who turned David on to his first marijuana cigarette, and that happened in Santa Barbara.
Okay, hang on. I got to just check. You have a pretty extensive index in Riot on Sunset Strip of clubs and just like, important things that happened at all these places. And and one of the groups that really looms large, we've obviously been talking about David Crosby and the Renaissance Fair and referencing the Byrds, but the Byrds, the other members of the Byrds also played those coffee houses and were part of kind of the regular normal folk thing before they added, electric to that and, electric instrumentation. How did that whole thing happen? That the Byrds would come together and that they worked with Dylan and, I guess like who's on first or what's on second, who came first, the chicken or the egg? Was Dylan's performance at Newport sort of the impetus for the Byrds to...
Yeah, well, no. Dylan's performance at Newport, which is constantly, repeated throughout rock history, that Dylan's performances in Newport is where, when Dylan went electric, right? That's very famous, that he got booed and all this other stuff. And it was definitely the landmark event that most people noticed, the Newport Folk Festival, Dylan going electric. That was a big deal. But that happened like after Bob Dylan had already, released Like a Rolling Stone, which was influenced by the Byrds. I mean, the Byrds and Bob Dylan had collaborated in late 1964 on Mr. Tambourine Man. That was going to be the first Byrds single. Now, the Byrds had been rehearsing it. They'd been given a demo of the song by Dylan's people, and they'd worked it up a little bit. And David Crosby actually is the one who said, no, write our own songs, just do our own songs. So when Bob Dylan came to play Wilson High School in Long Beach, he went to World Pacific Studios on 3rd Street here in LA, a building which still exists and a studio which still exists, but it's like it's sort of mothballed now. But anyways, Dylan came there and for 6 hours rehearsed with the Byrds, helping them to arrange and put together Mr. Tambourine Man, which became their first Columbia single. And it went, very high on the charts in England. Well, it went to #1. So, in many places, and I'm not sure of all the Billboard charts, Cashbox charts or whatever, in England's charts, but it was kind of like a #1 record. So Dylan started to record electrically more after that.
You were saying that the Byrds got that song and recorded it in '64, which would be a year before Dylan recorded his own version on Bringing It All Back Home. And that seems kind of like new history because everybody just considers them to be like a Dylan cover band for a while, or at least anybody who doesn't necessarily take that seriously. And does that kind of, in your mind, sort of cement some of the inherent prejudice against Los Angeles culture? Not that I'm asking you to be a booster or anything, but it does seem to kind of get skewed towards certain narratives.
Yeah, well, the problem is Bob Dylan himself, who's, obviously, a big fibber for many of his legendary things. The early Bob Dylan story and the early books on Bob Dylan were all filled with these fibs that he used to tell. And to this day, he kind of plays like that. And he has this real thing where he has managed to smush the Byrds' role in that success. You have to remember that Bob Dylan had like 2 songs that anybody knew him for. Peter, Paul and Mary recorded both of them. Blowin' in the Wind, 1963, big chart hit. And then to follow up, Don't Think Twice, That's All Right. Those are the only songs that Bob Dylan had hits with prior to the Byrds doing Mr. Tambourine Man. And then I guess the Byrds, like Derek Taylor said it, were like the booster rocket for all that other stuff that ended up happening, including, Bob Dylan. Now, Dylan was a huge influence on the Byrds, obviously. And the Beatles were a huge influence on the Byrds, obviously. But the Byrds ended up influencing the Beatles in a big way. If you look at the cover of Mr. Tambourine Man, and then look at the cover of Rubber Soul by the end of the year, you can see it directly. But it was even more intimate than that because when the Beatles, toured in 1965, they took their very first voluntary acid trip with the Byrds. The Beatles holed up in a house in West Side, up in the Beverly Hills area, for a long time while they were playing Seattle and Kansas City and everything in the Western Hemisphere. And, the East Coast part, they lived somewhere else, but the West Coast part of their tour, they lived in Los Angeles for a little while. So the Byrds hung out with them there, and they had this collaborative kind of moment where the Byrds were influencing the Beatles as far as what became the Rubber Soul sound,
They kind of look like the Byrds on the cover. Like they look.
Yeah. The cover of Mr. Tambourine Man is that it's a circle-shaped
fisheye lens.
Yeah, fisheye lens kind of thing, and the Beatles used the same fisheye lens and the same suede coats, kind of thing that the Byrds had already kind of done. Like the Byrds, it was like Sheriff of Nottingham stuff, they just they looked like, something from ye olde England. And I guess it was partially because the Renaissance Fair had happened right around the time, right before Bob Dylan had come to work with the Byrds on Tambourine Man in late '64. The first Renaissance Fair had already happened. And the first Renaissance Fair also had a program that became the Los Angeles Free Press. The first program for the Renaissance Pleasure Fair just became the second underground periodical in the United States, because the first underground periodical in the United States was the Village Voice in New York. And then it was the Los Angeles Free Press, and then it was the San Francisco Bay Guardian, and so on.
Yeah, I was kind of asking you about I was hinting at the Free Press earlier to see if that was sort of a connector for a lot of these disparate clubs in all these, cities and towns. And I think I remember you saying that it was at one point that was somewhere that people in the greater LA area could go to and find out where, subculture was happening.
And yeah, in those days, it was even, well, it was even more important then, because like you're not going to find out in the Los Angeles Times, or the Los Angeles Herald Examiner about a lot of stuff. I mean, the Los Angeles Times had been a hardcore conservative paper until like 1960, when the son of the grandson of the original owners took over. He just completely turned the newspaper around and made it like a world-class newspaper. But before that, it was this right-wing pulp, and the Herald Examiner was it was a Hearst newspaper. So what are you going to do with that? It wasn't a lot of intimate information. Los Angeles Magazine had pretty good listings for the Troubadour and the Ash Grove and some of those places, but outside of that, you weren't going to really find out about much.
Les Petites Sphinx.
Yeah, there was, the folk, but again, a lot of that stuff just focused on folk music, and at the beginning, the LA Free Press was only interested in folk and jazz, because folk and jazz is what was happening up on the Strip circa, let's say, 57 to 63. That was the primary,
No surf music?
Nah, surf music was really more like sock hops and teenage dances and stuff like that. It wasn't like.
But Dick Dale did play a beatnik in Beach Party.
Well, yeah.
Association between surf and beat, right?
The implication between surf and beat was really clear in the 1963 hit movie Beach Party, where Dick Dale plays a beatnik. And they're playing in sort of like what looks like a beatnik club. And that's because the beach area had all these beatnik clubs no matter where you went. Again, all the way from Laguna to Malibu and Topanga Canyon and up to Santa Barbara. There was a heavy, influence for kids to have these folk and jazz clubs, and these, beatnik kind of style people running around with the funny cigarettes and all that. It was, not mainstream, but it was an influence, and it was right in the heart of where people were surfing. In fact, the real surfers of those times were interested in playing Spanish melodies, Spanish guitar and things like that. That's where, and that surf music can be traced all the way back to, the Moors in Spain. And, that's where Misirlou kind of comes from. So, yeah.
Yeah. And then were there surf instrumental groups that like specifically cited like, Beat Generation or looked like them, or, I mean.
Yeah, the very first surf groups was called the Bel Airs. They were from, Redondo Beach. Palos Verdes, a really, expensive area, right? And these kids were all, Anglo and everything like that. But, and their parents had some money. And yet, the Chaz Stewart, the saxophone player for the Bel Airs, he was complete like goatee, and he wanted to be like those guys. These were teenagers looking at guys who were in their 20s going, I think those guys are cool. I want to be like them. Oh, look, they're into art, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. There are a lot of other LA groups, and just harping on the surf thing and how that sort of had a beat connection, and then going into the mid-60s psych thing. I mean, I'm thinking about like the Beach Boys and the Smile album cover, and working with Van Dyke Parks. Then also like the Doors, who we know had some real history in Venice before they were the Doors. And it just seemed, Frank Zappa, there's so many LA groups that really make amazing music and have a huge influence in the mid to late 60s, and like beyond just the Byrds. So if like the Byrds are sort of the catalyst, it seems to me maybe there's a whole lot of other stuff that's sort of getting its start in the beat scene, but then really starts to flourish in the mid to late 60s.
Well, the fact that teenagers were looking at the older guys is where it really happens. I mean, because that was the primary influence. When you go up to the Sunset Strip and you look at 1966, at the beginning of 1966, there was an art event on the Strip, and it was done by basically the Ferris Gallery artists. It was called the Artist Tower of Protest, and they got over 400, about 415, 417 artists from all over the world were supposed to send wood placards, and they built this, I'm not sure if this is the right word, venticular or something, like a billboard that went, like wedged in there and goes out like this. It was inside of this little hilly area. So they built it into the hilly area, and it was, all those 417 placards were, artwork stating something against the Vietnam War. Now, that might seem common in the 60s, but it wasn't common in early 1966. The Ferris Gallery guys who created this art project had started this movement, at least this art movement. In 1965, they had like protests right in front of Ferris Gallery on La Cienega. They circled around the street, they blocked traffic. And then they had another one out in Santa Monica, and one out by LACMA, Los Angeles County Museum of Art. The Billy Al Banks picture in my book of Billy Al Bankston holding a protest sign with people circling around him. I mean, so 1965, when Dick Johnson started the escalation of the war in Vietnam, the Ferris artists were right on that, because a lot of their customers happened to be people from the Rand Corporation, which is based in Santa Monica, right? And this guy, Roman Kostelitz, who was at UCLA, was sort of the guy in between the Rand Corporation people and the Ferris artists, because he knew he was getting information from the Rand people about Megadeth and all these things they were planning to do in Vietnam, like way ahead of them actually happening. And he informed the artists, and then they had these events called Dialogue on Vietnam at a place called the Warner Playhouse. And it was all these people, like 400 people inside the building, but then there was 400 people outside the building. Well, who's the 400 people outside the building? The teenagers, right? Like the hippest people are inside, and the teenagers are all listening to it on speakers outside, right? And they're all the way up on the street. When the Ars Tower protest in early 1966, it was up there for a couple of months. They had Black Panther kind of guys guarding this thing from all the right wing people who were trying to knock it down and stuff. So they stayed away because they didn't want to deal with tough black guys from South Central, right? So it was kind of it was a very good early Vietnam War protest, but it was all done via this art thing, and the kids were absorbing this directly, and they were hearing Bob Dylan songs. Like once the Byrds recorded Mr. Tambourine Man, 10 seconds later, you got the Turtles recording It Ain't Me, Babe. You have Cher recording All I Really Want to Do. I mean, right here in LA, just tons of covers of these really good Bob Dylan songs that people hadn't heard. And then all over the country, Dylan songs, and Bob Dylan made a whole lot more money in 1965 because this started happening, and 66 and 67 and 68 and 69 and so on. Dylan just became the most covered guy, other than the Beatles, maybe more than the Beatles. So Dylan's star really rose after the Byrds did Tambourine Man, and Dylan suppresses that in his story, and therefore all the hotshot guys at the New York Times who worship Bob Dylan and Bruce Springsteen, they just go along with Dylan's story, but it ain't true.
Was there an association between the Byrds and Mr. Tambourine Man and the advent of folk rock and what the Beach Boys did with Pet Sounds and Smile and all their experimentation?
Yeah, directly, because once the strip changed, the Byrds debuted at Ciro's La Disque. The old Ciro's nightclub on Sunset Strip became its boss, kind of a psychedelic pop art nightclub. And the Byrds debuted there on March 26, 1965, with Bob Dylan playing on the encore with them. They did their whole set. They ended with Tambourine Man, hooray, hooray, hooray. Dylan comes on with them for the encore, and they played All I Really Want to Do and Spanish Harlem Incident. March 26, 1965. I kind of consider that like the moment, because once that happens, the Sunset Strip is no longer cover bands and Johnny Rivers and people doing Memphis or Chuck Berry covers, and it becomes like, the Byrds were asked by the Whiskey A Go-Go, hey, you guys are taking away all our business. Well, can you help us get better bands in here? And who's one of the very first bands to play there? The Mothers of Invention. The Whiskey by the end of the year was booking the Mothers of Invention after the Byrds broke, not Johnny Rivers. Well, Johnny Rivers still played there once in a while, but You know, they moved into that area where there was Mothers of Invention, the Doors, the Byrds, Love, Buffalo Springfield, all that started to break
Captain
off the strip.
Beefheart.
And Captain Beefheart and the Magic Band. And, you know, there was a lot of rhythm and blues artists playing up on the strip more often then too, because Billy Preston lived in town. Brenton Wood lived in town. Charles Wright and the Watts 103rd Street Rhythm Band were a house band at his place called the Haunted House on Hollywood Boulevard, which totally, you know, part of that new club scene that happened after the Byrds. I mean, like
Afro
when the
Blues
Byrds,
Quintet.
huh?
Afro.
Yeah, when the Byrds broke at Ciro's, all the clubs immediately changed their style. You know, they all were trying to be swinging, you know, like dance clubs or whatever, trying to be twist crazed dance clubs. And it just went, okay, let's close that version of the club and reopen it. For example, the Crescendo existed. Gene Orban had that as a jazz club from like 54 all the way up to 1963, and he'd closed it. And he tried to use Chubby Checker and some people, you know, to play there, but he couldn't really work the Crescendo in as a rock place, or, you know, it was still primarily a jazz place. So he closed it, and it reopened as the Crescendo Tiger Tail for teenagers with the Turtles in 1965. So it's an example of how that club, you know, morphed into rock and roll. But then shortly after the, you know, that happened, they called that club the Trip. It went from being the Crescendo to the Trip. In 1965, a nightclub called the Trip.
Yeah. It's so cool. We could go on forever, and
Right.
I just love all the amazing connections that you make, and just how much of a survey you have kind of like in your mind of the field, and how all these things kind of connect and lead to each other. It's such a fascinating thing. And we, you know, it's great to have all these images that are overlaid over our conversation that come from your research and also my research. I'm really glad that we've had
You've done an amazing job.
the ability to collaborate and the way we have.
Yeah.
And so really grateful that you were able to be with us today. And, you know, I hope everyone will go out there and look up Domenic's books. They're really seminal. He's an amazing historian, amazing writer. Again, I feel really privileged to have collaborated with you over the years and to have you on the show. So now I'm going to send it back to everybody to go back to the opening of the fair today on September 23rd. And it's at brooklynbookfair.com. And keep an eye out for all the rest of the talks that we have throughout the fair. So thanks again, Domenic.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Good seeing you.
All right, talk to you soon.